Welcome to a special Trench Chat with Professor Mark Connelly from the University of Kent, who's not only a distinguished Great War historian and has studied the battles of the Great War and the tactics of the Great War, but in recent years has also looked at that really important interwar period when the Pilgrims travelled to the old Western Front. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So welcome, Mark, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, Paul, and thanks so much for the invite. It's great to be on this podcast. And what I was thinking about today, it always had exactly the same feeling as when I give a Western Front Association talk, that it's both an enormous privilege and pleasure, but it's also slightly terrifying because you're addressing, such an audience of experts. There is so much expertise out there. So, you have to be on your game for this.
Well, yeah, but I also think that as we've discovered, I think in all that we do, that you are always learning with this subject, aren't you?
Absolutely.
And there's so much still to find, isn't there?
Yeah.
The final page will kind of never be turned.
Never. That's right. That's right.
So in terms of that kind of interwar period, the Great War on the Western Front comes to an end in November 1918. The fighting ends, but the story of the Great War just doesn't suddenly stop, does it?
No, absolutely not. I mean, as we know, there is fighting going on, particularly in the east. So it's not. It's almost like a pretend end to hostilities as well, isn't it? They've all kind of convinced themselves. They've acted like a charade out that hostilities have really ended. But as you say, in the west, although there's no actual firing, all of a sudden there's a huge number of people scratching their head and thinking, what the hell do we do now with this mess? There is so much to be cleaned up. Clearly the war, in one sense, is going to go on for a very, very long time because of the amount of mess that needs cleaning up, because of and the problem of bodies everywhere. So the British Army is going to remain out there until September 1921. It's going to be shrinking rapidly, and of course there will also be a British force, as we all know, in Germany, in Cologne, for a very, very long time. So that sense of the legacy of the war in the West I think there are a lot of people in both the British government and the British Army who realise that the armistice is the end of a beginning, really, rather than the end itself.
And the kind of national grief of the Great War has obviously been building as the conflict has rolled on, but it's getting to a point where it's reaching a new level, really, and people want to deal with that grief in all kinds of ways. And the pilgrimage period after the war, people's ability to go to the battlefield, is all part of that, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Paul. That what particularly given the heaviness of the casualties in 1918, I think once again it unleashes, that year of 1918 unleashes a year, as we know, of extreme emotions, doesn't it? It's one of intense anxiety for the first half of the year, and then a kind of exhilaration in the second half of the year. And I think actually that those kind of two emotional forces come together on the 11th of November with that realization, right, so now is the point where I can truly start to process the death of a loved one, or a close family member or friend. And we as a family need information. We need to know. We need to know what decisions are being made. We need to know what role we're going to be allowed to play in it. And within a few days of the armistice, the War Office is swamped with communications, letters, telegrams, people appearing in person saying, can I go over now? Can I see? Because I do know where my loved one is buried, or I don't, and I want to get over and start exploring what's the situation. And Churchill, as Secretary of State for War, has to get up in the Commons on the afternoon of the 11th, and because he's expecting this, and he pretty much says, whoa, everyone, just give us a few days to get on top of this, and we can start to respond to these queries and inquiries. But it shows that kind of coiled spring, really, of grief and emotion. And because of that, I think Victorian and Edwardian world, where the involvement of the bereaved in the processes of disposing of a body, dealing with a body, the heaviness of that culture has meant that for 4 years, people have kind of sat on that, their moment to do something. Um, and here it's come, and they want answers to that pretty quickly. And that's what's going to keep the War Office, and particularly someone like Fabian Ware, scratching his head for at least the next 6 months. How do you deal with this?
And the practicalities of attempting to go at that stage were quite difficult, weren't they? Because
Yeah.
the Western Front had become an alien landscape with devastation of the likes that no one really could even truly imagine. So to get there was a difficult prospect.
Absolutely. Obviously, Dover Calais is still reserved for military traffic. Um, there are still there's obviously Folkestone Boulogne is still going, but a lot of that is military traffic, and the civilians that are going tend to be ones on official business, with official passes. So it's technically impossible, for anyone to go about a bit of tourism. And even if they can, as increasingly, people are finding ways of sneaking themselves on board, and finding ways around these regulations. But when they arrive, as you say, the French railway system is in tatters. The railways of the Nord region, the French regional railway officials are saying, look, we're trying to supply the armies that are trying to start their clear up operations here. We're trying to lay down track and everything else. Don't come. And also, of course, the French are dealing with civilians trying to come home. The locals are returning, and then the French regional governments and authorities there are saying, but we basically haven't even got standpipes for them to drink water from. So if we're going to chuck like Brits into this mix, standing around, and thinking that they're going to get a cup of tea in the afternoon when the locals can't get a bucket of water out, they could use to water their animals or whatever, we've got no chance. So Fabian Ware, you can see it in those early post-war meetings of the commission. They're all saying we've got to find ways of dampening expectation. People simply can't go over with the ease that they're expecting. But people do keep trying, and they can't. They simply cannot block it entirely. The big tipping point is, of course, July 1919, with the signing of the conference, the signings of the pieces, conferences in Paris, and then you get something like normal post pre-war cross-channel services arrive, but the Belgian ports are still in a bit of a mess. Getting all that stuff that had been dumped outside Zeebrugge and Ostend fully navigable for larger ships is a task. And as we know from people, particularly from northeastern England, it would have been the Belgian ports, where they'd have gone in to. That was their usual crossing point, Hull, Zeebrugge, and things like that. And that's going to take a bit of time to get running as well.
And Flanders does seem to be the kind of conduit for this in many ways. And Ypres, not only rises like a phoenix from the ashes for the civilians returning, but it becomes quite quickly this place of the centre of pilgrimages to the Western Front.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's where it's kind of pre-war and its wartime strategic significance are exactly why it becomes the Mecca. It's, as we know, it's the last great town close to the coast. It's therefore linked by rail and road communications. This is Ypres' ancient significance, isn't it, in the cockpit of Europe? It is the gateway to the Channel. It is the gateway to the central Belgian plain. So that's why it's been fought over so much. And it's because of that communication, shall we say, relative ease in the wake of the Great War, that attracts people to it. And the way it's not just the pre-war in what we might call the indigenous local population returning, it's also lots of other Belgians, even northeastern French people, who realize, aye, here's somewhere where we can make a few bob. This is almost, I think, by the second half of 1919, like an American frontier town, in the 1860s, it's a place of great opportunity. What is it? By August 1919, the town hall reports that 2 Italians have arrived and they want to set up an ice cream works because they think, here's our chance. Here we're in summer months. There's going to be Brits all over the place. We'll flog them ice cream. So yeah, that sense of it being this kind of interface between a place of great sorrow and great emotion, but also quivering on, teetering on being a party town almost. Where people come to gawp at the ruins as much as anything else.
And it even looks like the Wild West, doesn't it? In terms
It
of the kind of
does.
shanty town
Yeah.
wooden structures that were put up, which we see in the photographs of that period.
Yeah, absolutely. Those temporary houses, from the King Albert Fund and the American, that very generous contributions from America, its committee for the relief of Belgium. Yeah, and as anyone who's been to the Passchendaele Memorial Museum, you can see one of those huts in the grounds, can't you? Or if anyone goes out to see Nick and Co at Hall Grace, where they can go around and look at those huts. And it does, as you say, it seems to be like it's a world of shanties. It's almost like the troglodyte world of the old Western Front continues. People living in the dugouts. There's people, of course, start living in some of the pillboxes as well. Some of those are so extensive. There's a guy, I think it's near Cheddar Villa, actually, who comes back. And he's got all the local plans that he's dug out, and he knows exactly where his house is, and he finds this enormous pillbox on the site, and well, that's it. We've got to live in here. This is our house for the time being. And famously, wasn't there? I think it's in Rose Coombs' books, isn't it? The old lady, was it near Festubert,
In
that she'd been
Festubert, yeah,
born in it, hadn't she, and lived there till, was it 1977 or something, when she dies? So
something
that
staggering,
family,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
lived in there the whole lives, and succeeding generations lived in these relics of the war.
You can imagine though coming back and seeing the landscape and the village or the town that you'd known gone, and all that survived is this concrete structure. You'd think, well, I'm going to live in there because if that survived, it will always survive.
Absolutely. And as we also know, that once, if they can knock up something a little bit more salubrious next door, it's going to make a brilliant stable or somewhere where you can keep the farm tools. And that's how we often see them today, haven't they? That's what they've evolved into, is a kind of useful bit of outdoor structure, outhouse structure, that it's more trouble than what it's worth to get rid of it. Actually, you might as well keep it. Yeah, but also I think the kind of flip side of all that, of them arriving in devastation, is why the locals are so obsessed with really rebuilding as was. I think the psychological trauma of seeing everything that they'd known wiped out means that they're not prepared to embrace, some kind of new Bauhaus, smooth, sleek Art Deco lines of the 1920s. That's not going to suit them. They don't want to live in the middle of an architectural experiment. They want to be exactly as it was. That's having lost everything, getting back everything as it was. I think is so important to that returning population.
It's interesting you say that. There's the town of Ternier down on the Aisne near Saint-Quentin.
Mm,
That is very much like that. It was a kind of an architectural experiment
mm,
with these kind of American style gridded
yeah.
streets and so on. And you think, yeah, you lived in an ancient medieval town and you return to that, it would have been, again, quite alien, really.
Absolutely, yeah. And then, as I'm sure a lot of people have seen and noticed, how Zonnebecker, has that amazing church, doesn't it? And that amazing presbytery, the vicarage, where it is like a mini Hoover building. You could be on the Great West Road or something, couldn't you? And you half expect a neon sign above it with the Virgin on there or something. But that's all that ended up being built in Zonnebecker, because there was a plan from Huib Hostler, wasn't there, that the big sort of forward thrusting a futurist Belgian architect, for the whole village to look like that. And the locals pretty much sat on it and said, no, we're not comfortable with this. And so they built kind of glimpses of it, and then everything went back to as it was, because coping with modernity, or like the cutting edge of it, after they'd seen what cutting edge modernity had done to their existence, was not a comfortable thought.
No, quite. And so gradually, as these kind of places recover and buildings are replaced and new buildings, particularly tourism-related buildings like hotels and so on,
Mm.
are built within Ypres, I guess the number of hotels compared to pre-war was probably quite a lot higher in the 20s than it had been in the 1910s. The volume of people coming across
Yeah.
increases too.
Oh, absolutely, huge amounts. And as you say, because in some ways prefabrication helps with that. What is it? I think it's Stephen Graham, isn't it, who talks about the dolls' houses of EP. And that's what they seem like. These sections arrive, they're whacked together, and bang, within a few weeks, you've got a 6, not so much room, but like 6 or 8 cubicle. That's what they're building. These very tiny, almost like monk cell rooms. And you're a hotel. You're up and you're running, and you've got a business there. Obviously, the flip side to that, as I'm sure a lot of people know, is that straight away things like the think people like the Church Army, the Salvation Army, that are beginning to swap their operation from looking after Tommy to looking after the British visitor, the pilgrim, is the debate about over commercialization, and with that, exploitation of people, particularly exploitation of the bereaved. I think there's a kind of moral economy at work here, where I think everyone feels that if you're going as a pure tourist, you almost deserve to be ripped off. Fine. But if you're going because you're an old widow and you need to visit your son's grave, it's despicable should anyone try and pull a stroke on you, and there should be an alternative service that will see that kind of person through the experience.
And that kind of banditry where people are exploited because of the circumstances of their visit seems to be quite widespread then, with kind of battlefield guides that were there kind of pushing forward fake criteria for what they'd done in the war, and to give themselves status and knowledge, I suppose, in terms of a big market of people coming over.
Absolutely, yes. And I think that desire, that Robert Graves talks about in The Long Weekend, doesn't it? That obsession that all of those ex-officers have about using their title. Once you're captain or above and can fling that around, the idea that gives you status. And of course, what they're not telling people is, yeah, I was captain in the ASC at Rouen throughout the war, but now, I've plunked myself down in Albert or Pozières or wherever it might be, and I'm an expert on what happened across this front. And the closest that they got to it was when a horse dropped a shoe somewhere on the cobbles. That was about the closest they got to anything that sounded like an explosion. And that sense, though, of course, of anyone that had worn khaki, particularly an officer's tunic, therefore being in a position of trust, authority, and infinitely more trustworthy than, say, a local person might be, even though that local person is highly likely to have been the true expert, to really have understood it. But that sense at worst, sheer charlatans, and at best, shall we say, some of them spinning the truth out, or spinning out the details of their own experience with a bit more colour than it properly deserved. There is an enormous amount of that going on, and a lot of them, it's interesting, like to make, if they'd had any connection at all with the Directorate of Graves Registration and Inquiries, or any engagement whatsoever with the Imperial War Graves Commission, even if it was just like a couple of months, they want to show that in their credentials, because that makes them a trusted courier. We know what we're doing. We can make sure you get to the right place. But yeah, there's a fair amount, I often say this, there's a fair amount of people that if we were to make biopics of them, we'd have to CGI Terry Thomas to play them. That's the kind of thing that I think there's a lot of on the Western Front, at least for the first 5 or 6 years of it.
But I guess as well that, kind of considering what the landscape was like then, and the fact that this was a period in which cemeteries were being closed and moved, and while you might have a letter saying that someone was buried there, but actually they're now buried in Tyne Cot or Polterpell or whatever, there was a necessity to have an accompaniment with you, someone to lead you around these places.
Yeah, and in particular because the DGRE, bless them, would do that kind of interior culture thing. That they would often the confirmation of where a body was, particularly if it was unconcentrated, but they knew where it was, would be to send you the trench map references. Who the hell couldn't interpret a trench reference? You need a real expert that can translate this bizarre collection of letters and numbers into something. Because the Michelin map, you might be able to get a hold of something like that. That's not going to help you. It's nowhere near. So having someone with some kind of military experience is absolutely crucial. And that sense that often, because and ironically in some ways, some of the guys who had served further behind the lines are more likely to have picked up a smattering of the local language, can act as the interpreter for you. Can chat to someone And then say, oh right, well we better get ourselves, to the IWGC post in Albert, because they might, a concentration team might have been in, and they might now know where this is. So having a guide, and perhaps someone with military experience, is absolutely crucial. Yeah, because trying to interpret that landscape, and as we also know, people who fancy themselves as quite good with a map and a compass, at certain points, they say, the compass is going mental because of the amount of iron that's still in the ground. If it's a grey day, on that vast expanse of the Somme, you haven't a clue where you are. Once you've got off the Albert Bapaume road, you don't know whether you're north, south of it, you don't know where you are. So having someone that can lead you through the morass is really important.
And also that kind of grows out of this is a publishing industry of guidebooks to the battlefields, which starts quite early, I think.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, as I'm sure you know, Paul, that rather weird thing of producing a guidebook for EPA for soldiers during the war. What is it? That YMCA guide of 1918, where you think that's what your average Tommy wants, doesn't he? As he's marching through the ruins, he wants to know what things are. And isn't that beautiful? And the Michelin guides do exactly the same, because obviously they get going again. They get going during the war, don't they? As soon as the Germans retreat in 1917, that they produce a new guide to sort of some of those AIM sections, which are now vaguely approachable. And in the early days, some of those guides, particularly the Michelin ones, are all built upon basically flipping the coin of the pre-war guide. So it says, on this corner, there was once XYZ fabulous medieval church. Now if you look deep into the rubble, you will see there's an element of the altar still sticking out of it. So there's this sort of weird game of juxtapositions, but of course that allows for a text to be chucked out really quickly. You don't have to do that much work. What's emerging within a few months of the armistice, people like Atherton Fleming, who had been attached. He's too old really to serve, but had been a pre-war soldier and had been on that kind of cusp of the staff and those liaison kind of roles and eyewitness roles where he's helping with press liaison. He immediately is working on a guide which comes out by the late spring of 1919. The Reverend Coop, of the West Lancashire division, he does his one as well, and Muirhead's guide. That's, for a pre-war guide, revising itself. That has a first New Belgian edition by the autumn of 1919, and that's amazingly detailed. Actually, you can see, those kind of high-end guides that base themselves on things like Baedeker obviously managed to get men and women out there to do a lot of work on the ground so they can put together authoritative texts. And so, by the second half of 1919, whether, your armchair tourist or visitor, or your real one, your real active one, has got a pretty big range of stuff that they can go to their local Smiths or John Menzies, to get ordered and take with them.
And maps are part of that too, aren't they? There's
Yeah.
the one showing the cemeteries, and there's the pillboxes of Flanders by Thurlow,
Yeah.
and the Beatrix Bryce map that's
Yeah.
tucked in the back.
Yeah.
All kind of trying to help people decipher
Yeah.
that landscape.
Absolutely, and as you say, that Beatrix Bryce, the Pulteney, the Immortal Salient map, which I think if anyone was to get hold of a copy of that, that's still usable today in many ways. Isn't it? It's still as authoritative, it's still as comprehensive. It's interesting for looking at things that have since been lost. But what I love about that is for a map produced in 1925, where it's telling you roads that are still impassable, particularly in heavy weather. And that just shows you how slow the full recovery of this landscape is. There are certain places, particularly if you're going to take a motor vehicle, where in the winter you're just not going to get out of it once you've trundled down it. So the maps are amazing, and I think perhaps in some ways that is a continuation of the wartime culture. You might say that the Brits had as a general population had never been more exposed to maps than during the First World War, because newspapers are publishing them the whole time to show, we've advanced this far yesterday or whatever it might be. And that sense of looking at maps once you've got beyond geography lessons in school, I think for the wider population, that has been part of the wartime culture that's going to go on into the 20s and 30s.
Maybe a correlation to the old 1 inch and 1 mile maps that were so popular in that 20s and 30s.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And also that grew out of it, of course, and this is the subject of your latest book, are the postcards from
Mm.
that period and the images that were taken by pilgrims to the battlefields. We've got some written accounts and diaries and so on, but the images can tell us an awful lot, can't they?
Oh yeah, yeah. What the camera decides to look at, that correlation of what the camera decides to look at, and this is where like the methodologies of research I think have been revolutionized, haven't they, in a really good way by the internet. What things like eBay, Dell Camp, and tons of other sites, not necessarily trading sites, have allowed us to do is to discover in a way the world of ephemera that was always thought to be too quotidian, too everyday to be important to be archived. So things like postcards, I'll chuck that away. Whereas Grandad's diary, we might keep, but his little book of postcards, they don't look interesting, just general views of some pile of old mud. We'll fling those. And I think what the internet has done is brought all of that to life. And what amazed me, in some ways, what the true kind of leap forward of just how important the postcards were was to see just how many there were of them. Sometimes it's exactly the same image, but you'll see that there are 1,000 of them, up for sale on some site through different sellers. You think, my goodness, that shows there was a market for these things. They went out into like the general flow of society and life. And what is focused upon is fascinating. That obsession with ruins. I mean, I think that's what is mostly there. And the spectacular craters. Everyone loves a crater. And I would say craters are second only to smashed up tanks. Boy, do people like a ruined tank as a postcard image. And I think what's fascinating is doubly fascinating is sometimes where people have bought them and you can see wanted to keep them as pristine souvenirs, and so kept them in the way. The ones that are sent where there's text on the back, they're even more spectacular, aren't they? I mean, I found one. I managed to get one which was from Hill 60, which was someone writing to their uncle, and the fascination was in the terminology. It says something like, "Dear uncle, thought you'd like a snap of this while I'm in Belgium. I know you had so many great times here." Now, I've got you think that's probably arch. I mean, that's probably tongue in cheek, but the sheer fact that he feels that he can make a joke about it, he's not going to offend his uncle, shows you something about the way they understand the war as well. That is giving away a little secret about it. So yeah, the postcards to me was the great revelation of all of this, and that need to keep a photographic record, because again, as we know from wartime photographic exhibition, this is a world, isn't it, that's become photo literate, and to see is to believe and is to understand, no matter how manipulated we now know that image might have been. But those wartime photographic exhibitions, where people had queued up round the block to see these supersized images, I think we're seeing a continuation of that. I went, I saw, I bring this home as a permanent reminder of what I went to see.
And that kind of micro history of through the postcards all helps us to understand a bigger picture of kind of what was left and what interested people. I think that you mentioned about tanks. It's kind of a strange juxtaposition between the remnants of the modern world sitting there amongst what must have looked like the remnants of an ancient civilization.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, tanks, as we kind of lend themselves to all of that, shall we say, prehistoric language, don't they? Mastodons, dinosaurs, and the fact that they often get frozen almost like they had mechanical rigor mortis, so that they are almost like a fossil record that's there. And given the fact that, as we know, so many memoirs, in that flood of memoirs, people will talk about, ex-soldiers will talk about themselves having lived like cavemen or troglodytes. The fact that the pillboxes often seem like a caveman's existence. This hefty old lintel that you have to duck yourself under. You don't want to crack your head on that. And so I think the whole thing about that ancient world, and that somehow, and I think possibly the best writer on all of this is David Jones in Parentheses, where the Western Front becomes almost like this stock cube of all of the wars of human history, certainly of European history, and that somehow it was dissolved in like the boiling water of the Western Front. And you will find the traces of it, whether it be Arthur, whether it be Ulysses, it's all here, and we experienced that and followed that. I think, isn't it Sassoon who says at some point that I looked at our helmets and thought we might be marching to Agincourt. That there is this sense of this ancient world has been churned up. And I think that does carry on into the 20s and 30s. And as you say, in those images of destruction, it's like some great apocalyptic end. We've seen the collapse of the Roman Empire all over again, and it's left its traces, and we can stumble over them.
And do you think as well that those people that went across in that interwar period, who'd been fed that diet of wartime propaganda of smiling Tommies and happy life in the trenches, and they see all this, it's all part of that awakening really to the realities of what the war had been?
Yes, yeah, and you see in a lot of visitors, pilgrims, tourists, they will say what one of the lessons I think they come away with even more strongly is they cannot believe the degree of endurance, morale of the men, and it does quite a lot. Specifically mention they've got now more of a sense of Tommy humor, and how crucial that was to keeping them going. But they also admire them for holding on to that humor. So they both sort of understand it as a defense mechanism, as a coping mechanism, but they admire the sheer fact that they could have like embedded themselves in that kind of approach. Yeah, and now I think then they're understanding though, but what that perhaps the flip side of that is, you might say, possibly the slightly darker side, is to emphasize that those guys are still existing in a world apart. We've had a glimpse of it. We've come close to it. We might have even just touched its coattails. But bloody hell, we weren't there. And we really didn't live this. And so I think it means both admiration, but also a sense of keeping them slightly sealed off from us. We're never quite going to get there. It's our duty to try to understand it, and we're going to spend the rest of our lives trying to understand it, but we're never going to get there.
And those pilgrimages, when people went over to buy their guidebooks and their postcards and make sense of it all, for wealthy people, it wasn't really an issue about traveling to Flanders or the Somme or wherever. But for ordinary working people, it wasn't cheap, was it?
Oh no, and particularly in the early days where travel is so difficult to arrange, and can be so expensive, and before there is a full infrastructure, and that's exactly why almost organically the Salvation Army, Hearts, the YMCA, Hearts, the Church Army, they very quickly begin to realise in the earliest spring of 1919 that they're acting as a magnet for people coming to them to say, I'm looking for our Billy's grave. And this says, YMCA Somme, and we're on the Somme. What do I do? And so they start improvising guiding, really, and then they very quickly alter their infrastructure. They start rearranging their internal spaces, so they've got bunks and beds, and they start using essentially they're using some of the profits they made during the war, because although they pretty much sold everything at cost, there was so much bulk of trade that they did quite well, to help subsidize, to help pay for this. And then the great Kiwi army chaplain, the Reverend Matthew Molyneux, he very quickly gets involved in this and sets up the St. Barnabas hostels, and they all then mushroom out. They collaborate a lot. They deal with each other a lot. Sometimes it's quite difficult, as I'm sure you've seen, Paul, dealing with Molyneux. He's quite a big character, shall we say, and he when he thinks he's got it right, very few people can dissuade him from it. And what they are saying to anyone that wants to use their services, because they begin to advertise them as standard packages, is, look, this is what it costs us to get you to XYZ place. If you can afford it, please send it to us, because that helps us. If you can't, send us what you feel that you can get out of your pocket. If you can't afford anything, don't worry. And so they're using that kind of income stream to cross-subsidize. But with the soldiers, demobilized soldiers and sailors unions, they're both lobbying government, and where gets involved with this and saying, look, under our charter, we've got no responsibility for looking after people, but clearly we're interacting with people the whole time. If this is a land fit for heroes, that also means their relatives have to see where their dead heroes lie, right? You've got some responsibility to fund this. And it's quite a big debate, 1919 to 1921, 1922. How much money should the government put in to help people visit the graves? And in the end, the Treasury makes a two sets of payments to the charities and says to them pretty much, you distribute it as you will, you use it, you clearly have the expertise. And they string that out for much of the 20s. And what with that fact that people that can afford it are so impressed by that service that they often do pay, in fact, even more than they're asked to, that helps to create a way of helping poorer people get across the channel.
And organisations come out of this as well. The Eep League, I suppose, is a good example of it. But also for the British Legion, I guess it's a foundation of who they are, leading to that great pilgrimage in 1928.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that for that, in one sense, the British Legion is a relatively late national, as a national body as opposed to local branches, player in the game. And I think it's because people like the Eep League have set the tone for them, and that sense of raising cash to help the poor is really a really important ideological and moral issue in the 1920s, and that sense of it's something that we all owe the poor. We owe them this opportunity. And of course, by the time the British Legion get involved, they've reached that crucial tipping point, haven't they? Because they've realised in a very savvy way, you might say, just as St Barnabas realises, that 1928, 27-28 is when you can start bringing in fully those who are grieving the missing. They can be taken in the 20s, and often are, through a good bit of detective work, to the last known place, where their loved one was seen alive, or this is where they went into the attack, so they were probably, killed and went missing somewhere around here. And that in itself is a kind of form of catharsis, is a form of understanding what happened, but you still haven't got the name, you still haven't got the site. Obviously, with the unveiling of the Men in Gate, you then have the heralding of 10 years of memorials to the missing being unveiled. And the British Legion, clicks in at just that moment, I think, to, shall we say, to help that constituency of pilgrim that, through no fault of anybody else's, hadn't been fully serviced, shall we say, in the earlier 20s. I think that the memorials to the missing become increasingly important in the 30s.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I hadn't considered that before. I suppose in that period, like you say, the decade after the war, and then the next decade, which is Thiep Val and Lewes and Men in Gate and everything else, that brings a new pilgrim. Where there is no sepulchre, there's no grave to go to, but there's more to it for them. The importance of a field takes on greater significance.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And you'll often find that those who go out, I mean, there's that whole slew, I think it's Easter 1930, isn't it, where Dud Corner, the Luce Memorial, Pozières, it's all on the same day, and they have various generals strung across the Western Front unveiling them. And sometimes people have used that, some of the people that looked at visiting, to say, oh well, there weren't big numbers at the unveiling of the Pozières Memorial. No, it's because they're unveiling like half a dozen on the same day. And you've got people, going to the one that's very important to them. But what you'll often find is the people that have gone to that memorial are often, by that stage, quite regular visitors to the Western Front, because they've come out to see what they do know. And this is kind of the completion of the story. Now they're coming to the place of commemoration, and they're quite seasoned travellers. And it's the last chapter in the book for them.
But of course, then, as the war clouds are gathering again over Europe, and September 39, pilgrimages of that kind come to an end.
Yes. Yeah. And it's amazing how many people are out there in August 39, and are starting to rush home at the end of August and say, in when they get back, either to letters to the local press or sometimes on the postcard, we've seen French soldiers everywhere. They're obviously up to something's up, and indeed, I think in the second half of the 30s, thanks to the turn in international affairs, it actually increases, the footfall. It spikes all over again. But then we have that fascinating thing, as you were kind of alluding to there, Paul, of as soon as the new BEF arrives, one of the first things they start doing is visiting the cemeteries and memorials. What was it? Alan Brooke goes to the Vimy Ridge Armistice Day memorials. He writes a nice little bit in his diaries about standing there, and it took him back to 1917, and he remembered all the stuff that they'd done. Who's the? I'm just trying to remember the name of the officer who then Gunbuster, that's his pseudonym. And he writes those lovely collection of short stories, and one of them is about visiting the Menin Gate, isn't it? And setting up an anti-aircraft battery near the Menin Gate. So that sense in which, in the first, in that what we call the phony war or the Boer War period, the second BEF is almost consciously reliving elements of the original BEF. It is truly remarkable. If the first, I always say this to my students, if the Great War is meant to be this incredible shadow of intense horror and disillusion, why in September and October 1939, like tabloid newspapers reprinting the songs of the First World War, like kind of dishing them out for free to battalions going over to France, and then running columns saying, will this war produce as many good, like as funny marching songs as the last war? Will there be Mademoiselle from Armentières back? And then you get all these soldiers visiting these cemeteries. The shadow of the Great War into the Second World War, and that need to visit the places, because of course, we can leap forward again now to 1944, can't we? As soon as these places are recovered, liberated, soldiers start visiting them again. And if anyone has looked at soldiers bored in Germany waiting for demobilization in 1945, they will often see that a truck will take them off to Ypres for the weekend if they get out of their camp in Germany. And so that way in which the First War is being literally revisited through the Second World War is a fascinating story. One, I think it's worth exploring a bit more detail by us all at some point.
Yeah, I mean, in the early days of leisure tours, I took a lot of guys who'd served in World War II back to see their dad's name on the Menin Gate or in a cemetery around Ypres, which they'd last seen when they were in khaki in either 39, 40 or 44, 45. So it is an interesting period.
Yeah.
But post-war, the pilgrimages don't quite recover on the same. They don't return to the pre-war level of people visiting those battlefields.
No, it goes very quiet. I mean, obviously, for the British Legion, they've got a whole new focus, which are obviously sites of the Second World War. And if it is going to be France, as we know, it's going to be Normandy. That's very obvious. And in some ways, it's that very interesting kind of chronological gear meshing that in 1955, obviously you've reached the 10th anniversary of the end of the most recent Great War. And at the same time, some people start saying, crikey, and we're now ticking down towards 50 years since the original one. In that kind of 1964 lead time, you might say bleeds back into that mid-50s moment as people think, as that sense of perspective about what we've just come through and where it fits in a wider pattern, I think starts to play out. And as we know, that's when you get Leon Wolf writing, in the mid-50s. It's interesting that just as what you might say, that first great tranche of chewing over what the Second World War means, it almost organically leads into people thinking, and how was that connected to the thing that went before it? And so in the late 50s, you start to see the first little, to use a former chancellor term, green shoots of recovery, shall we say, of people starting to go back to Ypres, start to put that thing together. And obviously, of course, by the late 50s, you're also starting to get that other crucial demographic thing of the oldest of the First World War veterans are retiring. And they have got often better pensions than anyone has ever had before in Britain. They've got that bit of leisure time. They've got better health now, thanks to the NHS. You know, they can get out and they can do things. So they start going back, and they often start taking their sons or grandchildren, or if their son, you know, or daughter or whatever had served over in France, Germany, they visit a Second World War site and will go on to do what Dad had done. You know, and so that is, I think, then paving the way for 64. And 64, I don't think is quite as big as people suspect. My feeling on kind of cursory research on this is it's really 66, and it's the Somme anniversary. And that's the search, because also then we're on the route to that other great, you know, you might say kind of incidental tool, but crucial thing. We're on the way to the roll-on, roll-off ferry. And no one can underestimate the importance of that. Once you don't have the winch car on board anymore, and by 68, you know, 69, that has arrived. All of these veterans, even more of them, have retired. Either they've got a car, or their son or their daughter has, you know, they can get themselves over there. And then, as we know, by the 1970s, the French are starting to expand their motorway system as well. And bang, we have the basic formats for a whole new tourism explosion.
And I think that's the interesting kind of aspect of this, is that this is history that never really ends, because that continuation of how the war stopped, pilgrims arrive, people make sense of a new landscape, and the meaning of that landscape changes, and it's changed and changed and changed ever since.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, of all the podcasts, the one that I've listened to it most repeats is the one with Amy, as I would, you know, and that's what her work's about, isn't it? And your work, everything you do that you're steeped in, Paul, is about watching that landscape never ceasing to evolve as a witness, and it has new things put into it to help us act as kind of points of remembrance, points of orientation, some of which I must admit the aesthetics of it I would often question and think, I think we could have lived without this, or if they wanted to put something slightly different, you know, but personal taste is taste, right? So I'm not condemning anybody else. He puts in as a quick rider there. But yeah, to watch this landscape put on its kind of accretions, its extra encrustations, and you know, almost like geological or archaeological layers, the fact that in certain time periods the thickness of sediment, you know, comes up much more quickly than at other times. And it strikes me, I don't know if you think this, Paul, that probably since about the mid-90s to now, we've gone into a really kind of concertina thick period of memorialization, you know, and what that tells you about our own culture, our own society, about the way we relate to the past, you know, I think is another absolutely fascinating issue. But yeah, to see the world of the old Western Front now, and I'm going to sound like a real ancient hoary old warrior, you know, compared when I first started going out in the mid-80s, in certain places it is as transformed as it must have been for some of those veterans if they went back in the late 20s. You know, it seems as different again because of the amount of pure memorial development that has occurred.
Definitely. I mean, Ypres probably changed most of all, but you know, when I think of the Somme in '82 when I first went there,
Right.
I don't think that had really changed since the 20s and 30s. You know, it kind of felt like a sleepy little town. And even when I lived there, you know, the kind of same shops that had been there since the town was rebuilt
Yeah.
were all still in place. But that in the last, you know, as you say, last 2, 3 decades, that has changed immensely, and the desire to memorialize has never been stronger, probably stronger
No.
in those 3 decades than the previous 7.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, obviously things that we're really still debating as a society now. I think one of the great elements of this has been the resurrection in interest in things like the experience of the colonized peoples, you know, the ones that came under the British Empire, and rediscovering in a way. I'm often saying this to my students, it's not so much that those stories were lost, because the Imperial War Graves Commission, you know, admittedly perhaps not in a purely you know, symmetrical or even way is telling those stories in the 20s. The memorials are built, you can see them, but we kind of lost touch with this during that process of decolonization. In some ways, Britain lost touch with this story, and with the changes of our the demographic of Great Britain, we've obviously got much more involved in identities, what it means to be British, what it means to have been part of the British Empire, and for whenever that story or that issue becomes controversial, I always point to the great thing: we're talking about it, we're thinking about it, we're engaging with it, and people want to know more, and so in ways that I don't remember 30, 40 years ago, people want to see things like, where are there burials of the Chinese Labour Corps? Where will I see British West Indies Regiment? Where will I see Indian memorials? And I think things like that have been actually, amazingly good for us as a society. Actually, I say at times it means painful memories. It means confronting some big issues that are controversial. But one of the great things is, we engage, we think, we scratch away at the history because of this, and we want to visit the sites and see them.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think the silent cities, the cemeteries of the Great War, have kind of always been there to lead us to these stories, but we kind of haven't seen them. The cemeteries were far more inclusive in many ways than people perhaps realise.
Yeah.
With the burial of Chinese soldiers, separate Chinese cemeteries just dedicated to them, Indian cemeteries, and the list kind of goes on. And I think that's again goes back to where we kind of started, where that last page of the Great War will never be turned, and we're always discovering something new or rediscovering angles of the war. That's its eternal fascination.
Absolutely, yeah. As I think any of us who are interested in history have ever said to anybody else, if you could tell an entire history entirely, there'd be no need for any more books, would there? There'd be one book written on that subject, and that would be it. But there's always a new way of thinking about it. There's always a new angle. The light will always shine on it in a different way. And constantly, I often will say, like to my students, I almost treat the past as if it's something like a great totem pole, full of hieroglyphs and wonderful carvings. And depending on where I stand, at what time of day and in what season, the light will fall on it in a different way. And I might see a new detail or a new way of thinking about it. So you sort of do this constant circling of the past, and then are always rethinking it, reshaping it. And that's its fascination. And of course, that's why it's always alive in the present. The past is never dead. It's part of us, with us. And the way we think about it is absolutely crucial.
Absolutely. I mean, I could talk to you about this all day, but we're in the confines of a podcast, so we'll keep them waiting for more stuff further down the line. So your book is out now.
Yes, it really is. That's right. And as you could say, for that door that which just won't stay open, that coffee table that's a bit wonky, and in an emergency, that Blackadderism, it's soft, strong, and thoroughly absorbent. So what can we say? But yes, Postcards from the Western Front is out now with McGill Queen's University Press.
And I'm sure full of absolutely fascinating images that will keep many of us absolutely enraptured, kind of working our way through that. We'll put a link to that on the podcast website so people can find that, and also to social media and stuff like that. Mark, thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and see you again sometime on the Old Front Line.
That'll be great. Cheers, Paul. I look forward to a beer and EPA. That'll be wonderful.
Fantastic. Cheers, Mark.
Bye.
You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.